In March 2001, the CBI and the government of Iceland announced a joint declaration to abolish the deviation ban and adopt an inflation targeting regime with a target to bring inflation as measured by the 12-month rise in CPI as close as possible to 2.5%. But the result has never been satisfactory, and the CBI was under criticism and said its monetary policy were not sufficiently tight. In 2007, the CBI published an article to compare its policy rate after 2001 with results generated by the Taylor Rule to prove that its tightness of monetary policy was approximately on par with other central banks if they were facing similar situations.
Thanks, people, for talking about Iceland's economic background and its monetary policy. I'll now talking about the cause of failure of Iceland's economy, in particular for failure of inflation targeting and rule-based interest rate policy. Iceland is a small country with which the economy is highly dependent on trade with other countries. For example, you can see in the pie chart that the trade to GDP ratio is 39 in 2008, which is very high ratio. As mentioned by FIFA, Iceland mainly produces fishery products only. However, most of the necessities like food and beverages has to be imported from other countries, like in the Euro areas or in the USA. As CPI, the Consumer Price Index, mainly measures the inflation rate of those necessity goods. It is not hard to imagine that Iceland's price level is tightly related to price level of major trading partners. For example, in the figures, you can see that the CPI is highly related to exchange rate of the major trade partner. For example, for the largest trading partner, that is the Euro region, we can see that the correlation between the exchange rate of kroner and euro and CPI is as high as 0.935. So, what's the problem if CPI is highly related to the exchange rate? From our statistics, Iceland's exchange rate volatility is very high, as total monetary aggregate for Iceland kroner is very small. Therefore, the exchange rate can fluctuate a lot if institutional investors sell or buy Iceland kroner. For the very high exchange rate volatility is transferred to CPI volatility. As a result, the central bank is difficult to control CPI until a reasonable level, as the exchange rate fluctuates a lot. Therefore, people start to question if central bank is capable to control inflation. If people start to question central bank's ability to control inflation, so inflation bias will arise. That means that the inflation can never reach the target set by central bank, that is the 2.5%. Even kroner appreciates a lot. As mentioned by FIFA also, Iceland is using Taylor Rule with interest rate as central bank's major policy instrument. Taylor Rule is a passive rule that passively responds to inflation gap and output gap. For a typical Taylor Rule, interest rate will increase passively if inflation rate is higher than target level, that is 2.5% in Iceland case, and interest rate will increase passively if output is higher than natural output. For Iceland case, as shown in the equation, it is a special form of Taylor Rule that some weight is assigned to past interest rate level. So the response of interest rate to inflation and output gap should be less vigorous. Even though the fluctuation of interest rate should be less vigorous, as predicted by Taylor Rule announced by Central Bank of Iceland, which is shown in previous slides. However, as inflation bias is high due to exchange rate volatility, interest rate implied by Taylor Rule is set high to target inflation. In normal case, high interest rate can reduce output back to natural level and reduce inflation. As Iceland's economy is overheated, high interest rate suppose can cool down the economy. This is because to achieve a higher interest rate, money aggregate has to be reduced, so turnout actual inflation would be smaller than inflation expectation set by general public. If the inflation rate is lower than expected one, due to nominal wage contract explained by Keynesian and asymmetric information theory explained by neoclassical, the economy can be cooled down. In the slide, it shows the Lucas supply function. The Lucas supply function is the mathematical equation that explains nominal wage contract and asymmetric information theory mathematically. So, in normal cases, coefficient A in the Lucas supply function is positive. That means the higher the inflation gap, the higher will be the output gap. However, a positive coefficient A in Lucas supply function only occurs in normal situation. By doing the regression, we find that the coefficient A of Lucas supply function in Iceland is negative and equals to negative 2.134. That means the lower the inflation gap, the higher the output gap. So the situation in Iceland is totally opposite to theoretical results. In this slide, we show our regression results and data statistics. The graph in top left of the slide shows there exists inverse relation between output gap and unexpected inflation. The graphics in bottom right shows the same. We can see the lower the inflation gap, that is the less difference between inflation and inflation expectation, the higher output and higher private consumption growth is anticipated.